Hey gang, Kevin here, Life22, and we are live again, right? Yeah, so hopefully all of you guys had a great night. I know you all stayed up watching the live stream from last night, but today we are reviewing another series that I had finished watching, and it's one after another with these. So I wanted to get them banged out, wanted to get them done. I'll probably have another one tonight, and then we'll get back onto. I've got a list of other things that came through that I'd like to also review, but so this one was Jordan Peterson's three-part series on marriage, and I thought this was a really good expose on just the entire topic. I don't know, like most people in my generation, and I can never tell. I never follow the generations. Am I a millennial? Am I a Generation Z or Generation X or whatever the hell they're called? I think I'm like on the cusp of being being Gen Z or a millennial, or I can't, Jesus. Anyways, like right in between two. Like I wouldn't consider myself a millennial, but I think I am. But like I'm just barely made it in to that category. But yeah, so I mean, growing up in our generation, right? Like you divorced home and stuff like that, and you got resentful parents that they were married and they can't believe that they were married and they never wanted to get married again, and you live your life like that. And it actually wasn't until this past year that I thought it was all a crock of shit that people were getting married, and oh, it's fucking, why would you do that, right? Like it didn't make sense. And then this past year my brother got engaged and my sister just recently got engaged, and we got weddings and engagement parties coming up, and I just found out my cousin, who's been married like 15 times, is getting married again. Well, not 15, but that's the inside joke with the family. And so it was one of those things. So like, it's just one of those, you kind of, I used to take everything on the topic as like, as if it's funny, is like as soon as my dad died, the idea that like marriage was stupid kind of died with him. Like a lot of his ideas, like a lot of things that I was like ingrained in as a child were like haunting me, and now all of a sudden it's like the ghosts are all gone, right? Like so. But the first part, so there's a quick trailer, and it's like just under a minute, and then the first part is called The Promise, and it's a 45-minute segment, and he kind of describes like what it is and what like helps you kind of like, based on his advice, why monogamy is good, the intellectual purpose of it, his relation to his 33 years of marriage to his wife, and like answers like the age-old question, like why get married, right? So that's like a very it covers a lot, right? And he describes, let's see here. So the topics covered include why monogamous marriage is rationally, intellectually, and spiritually better than short-term hedonistic pleasure of the single life, creating the perfect platform for having children, how to consistently have the best intimate life you could possibly imagine with your partner, and more. So he does, and that's really what this first part talks about. And it's a real clincher, right? It drags you right into the series. Now, I don't believe this is on YouTube. I believe this three-part series is behind the paywall of the Daily Wire. But if you're not a member of the Daily Wire to be able to watch this, you're really missing out on great content. So that said, plus there's no better way to be part of the Sweet Baby Gang, right? It's like, anyways, so yeah, he goes down this path, and it's just really just makes some good points, right? Like like everybody thinks that single people have, for like just the initial, right? Like everyone's like, well, when you get married you don't have sex, right? Like no, actually you have more than if you weren't, right? Now obviously like he gets into the age of like child rearing years, like there's a lull, but and not just the fact that like, because you're making an intimate connection with somebody and not just like endless lines of strangers. And the endless lines, like everybody thinks it's like a damn amusement park where like you got to get like, you know, there's people showing up at your door for like the speed pass, you know what I mean? And like it's not really the case, and you're not making intimate connections with these people, and there's something like there's a void that's missing, and then it's like you get stuck in this trap of like just sexual partner after sexual partner after sexual partner, and it doesn't fill the void, right? Like you just keep consuming this thing that you think is filling something that you wish you had, and it's not, right? It's not. It's just it isn't doing what you're expecting it to do, right? Like it's chasing a dragon, right? Like or in terms of not how he refers to dragons as problems, but how, well, I guess kind of, right? But in more of like when you have an addiction, right? Like you're just becoming addicted to this, trying to find the answers under the same stones, right? It's almost Ben Franklin's what is it, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing without over and over and expecting different results. That's insanity, right? That's kind of what happens with addiction, right? You're like, oh man, I'm gonna get more and more and more and more and more pleasure out of this, or more and more and more. I'll find that void. I'll find what I'm looking for by just constantly doing it. And it's like, no, not really. And yeah, so he talks about that in that first part of the series, and the second part. The second part gets into, let's see here. So the second part is called negotiation, and in part 2, Jordan points out the keys to successful marriage. It's not just about listening and communication, but a way in which we do so, the way in which we do so matters. The topics they cover include the importance of negotiation, why structural family meetings matter, sorting out the past from your and your partner, whose fault it is, or is it really, and why with very few instances divorce is not a quick fix. And so he kind of talks about the negotiation, because you're negotiating the rest of your life with another person, and this, I mean, you can apply a lot of these in the long-term sense of like maybe long-term commitment relationships or marriage, or however you see fit in your life if you're really still gung-ho against it. But it's one of those, like, he allows you to, he kind of takes you down, like, you know, like, because now then all of a sudden you negotiate with children, and you have to, you know, like, teach them right from wrong, and be, you know, and then he also I believe this is the one that he points out a very intellectual argument, which is that, like, you know, most people are selfish, right? You're in a single life, everything about you, and then when you, like, you get married, you commit to somebody, you're bringing somebody to your own level, maybe not all the time, and this is what a lot of people miss. Like, you're putting somebody at the same, you care about them just as much as you care about you, and sometimes more, but most of the time less. And that's where most people's category is. They're like, this person's with me, but they, like, a lot of people just care about themselves still more than that other person. And it's not until you generate to the third stage of, you know, self, partnership, and then children, where you actually have a third line item, and that is the thing that usually sparks people to realize that there's something more important to their own life than them, and it is their children. And it allows them to also, if they've put their spouse behind them or at the same level as them and not in front of their own life, then a lot of times that the having of children in a marriage or in a relationship will actually draw them to realize that the other person is more important than them, and that it brings them up either to level or to a more importance than their own life. Usually the children still hold a higher pedestal, but the rising tides raise all boats, right? And that's kind of the theory behind that. And it's a great kind of explanation if you're just, you know, just blindly going through the motions of life, and you're not really certain of what's going on and all these other things. Then, you know, you really, you're really just kind of like, you're deadening your senses, and you're deadening your life by not paying attention to what's going on in your life. And it's very important to kind of hash a lot of that out and try to think about it beyond, right, what you just kind of like are in the motion of, right? So sometimes, like, looking at the motions that you're taking and the things that you're doing, is really helpful and really cool, really. So I mean, that was the second one, and then I mean, because it's we're all in this cycle, right? Like we're all in this biological cycle to be born, grasp, be able to survive on our own, then, with the help of our parents, obviously, then go find a mate, have children, and then I'll help them along the way to doing the same thing, and then the cycle starts over again, and over and over. And as maddening as that is, and as you can let that allow depression to set in your own life, thinking like, well, like what's the point of it all then? If I'm just like one cog in a million year little generation of a machine, well, I mean, that's up to you to determine, like, the happiness and the pride that you would take in fulfilling your role in that manner, and or what else you do in the world besides just doing what what appears to be a, maybe not the sole, but a large purpose in our being, is to set forth your genetic code and continue to propagate the species. So and then his last part here, I guess we'll just touch on real quick. No, I guess not real quick, but in part 3, Jordan explains that, let's see here, that what you're sacrificing by getting married are the things that should have already fallen by the wayside with the advent of maturity, and that the gains far outweigh the so-called losses in freedom. Topics include why marriage is the highest form of play, I guess how career, children, and marriage can and should work together, why renewing vows is sacred symbolic act, and why we should strive to live up to the ideals of marriage rather than forsaking them. So a good thing that he points about here is to touch on that first topic, that is like why it's the highest form of play. So he's a clinical psychologist, right? So all species involve themselves in play, right? Like rats play with each other. We've got a little dog that plays with our big dog, and they've learned to play with one another, right? And little kids will play house, right? And they're trying to, better understand the world around them and that hierarchy that we just described of the cycle, right? Like they grow up, they become, adolescents, and then so in their prepubescent years, they're playing house with one another, kind of replicating a home structure, right? As Jordan says in a lot of other areas, like children look for islands of stability, right? So like that's why like setting them on routines, like go to bed at the same time, and have your 3 meals a day, and go to school regularly, and church on Sundays or Sabbath on Saturdays or what have you, and then just keeping these little things. You got to clean your room before you got to do your homework, before you get your iPad, before you do this, you have to eat dinner, before you do that, you've got to go to bed at a reasonable hour, and even on weekends, maybe you get to stay up an hour later, and you just give them these little rules that allow them to jump from island to island to island to continue to create the fractal structure and the pattern that is their life. And so the highest form of play, when you're no longer a child anymore, right? Like you become an adolescent, and you go out and you do the mating cycle, and then you go and you kind of like you've reared children, and then what happens is you actually become house, right? Like you're not playing house in make believe, you're playing house in real life, and that is the highest form of play, and that's what he gets at there with that little that caveat, and then how to learn the finesse, if you will, of how your career, your children, and your marriage can all work together, intertwine, giving you a very fulfilling life, right? And then like remembering that and constantly keeping on yourself. It's like your diet, right? Like you look in the mirror in the morning, you're like, oh man, I'm getting fat. I gotta keep on myself to keep up my exercise routine, to eat healthy, to do all that other stuff. But just like everything else, everything is work, and you've got to work at your marriage. You've got to work on yourself. You've got to work on, your children. You got to work on your relationships, and that's what he's getting at with this. And then he kind of helps you show how like those, the stability of those things far outweigh so-called loss of freedoms, right? Like your freedom to go out and, I don't know, be promiscuous and have multiple partners, and there's no fulfillment in that. So that's why he's saying it's a so-called freedom. Like, I can do whatever. And he points this out in one of his lectures, and he says, what if you had absolute freedom, right? Like, what would you do, right? And most people are terrified by what they realize, which is that they don't know what to do. You give somebody all the time in the world, what do? They just putz around. Now, if you tell them what to do or give them some sort of a structure to follow, like now all of a sudden they find joy in fulfilling that structure, that archetype that they are, like, you know, maneuvering their way through like a maze. Like, that's, you know, we're good at going through the maze, not so good at understanding that we have to create the maze in front of us so that we can trick ourselves into going through it. And that's why these archetypal structures in our society are very healthy for us to kind of create in front of us, even if we're cognizant that they exist. I'm sure it's easier for people that are not cognizant, are being led by others and given these archetypal structures. You know, you're told by, you know, the church, you're told by your family, you're told by this is how you should be, and then you find meaning in that maze that they've put in front of you, that chutes and ladder ride you call life, right? That board game, they've set it out for you, or you create your own. And you're cognizant that you have to create this because you have to invoke yourself to go through this natural urge to fulfill the maze that you must walk through. So you create the maze and then you run through it. But that's, you know, that's a step above. I'm assuming it would be easier if somebody throws down a map in front of you and you just follow the map. You follow the instructions, and that's how most people are. But, you know, if you are willing to take the step and be cognizant that you have to, you know, do more than just go through the motions of it, you know, and create and adjust your sails as you will, you still need to steer the ship, right? Like, we instinctively want to steer the ship, but if we don't have a path in which to steer the ship to, we seem lost, depression sets in, we don't take care of ourselves, we don't take care of our marriage, we don't take care of our children, and that's a path you don't want to fall down. And I will let the rest of you guys get back to the Bills game, and that is my review on the 3-part series from Jordan Peterson on marriage. And I thought it was an exceptional review, an exceptional series, and more so than I mentioned previously that the Logos and Literacy series was. But this was very well thought out, very well, like, just great pearls of wisdom. So thanks, guys. We'll catch you probably later today. I've got one more. I finished part 1 of Exodus, the review, the roundtable review of Exodus by Jordan Peterson as well. I finished the last part for part 1. It's an 8-episode series for part 1, and they're reconvening in January this month to start filming the next one. So I'm assuming in about 4 months that this part 2 will be released. And I also have a book I'm finishing up, so maybe I'll even finish the book today, we'll review the book tomorrow, and jump onto a new book. So, all right, guys, we'll catch you later on Life22.